Hi there, and welcome to the Steam Cafe vlog. I am Yen Verhoeven, and I'm going to talk about myth-busting labs that demonstrate the nature of science today. So in this video, what we're going to cover is what are the three different definitions of science, the purpose of myth-busting, using metamaps instead of scientific method, a myth-busting example, parameters of a myth-busting lab, hypotheses, variables, and conclusions, where to go to get myth-busting ideas, and then finally, I'm going to give you some suggestions for ideas and how you can end those experiments with a project. Now let's talk about the three different ways that we can think of science. First, science is a body of knowledge that describes our understandings of the natural world. They're built on foundations that have accumulated over time from multiple sources, and they are constantly and critically assessed and revised based on new evidence and findings. Now, why this is so important, and one of the reasons I stress to teachers why science is very different from religion, is because this body of knowledge is constantly critiqued, assessed, revised, and reevaluated. That is not the case for a lot of different disciplines. It's not the case for religion either. Science in itself is not a permanent body of knowledge because it's always evolving as we learn more about our natural world. And that's the other thing that I want to talk about too, is we really are dealing with the natural world. If it's supernatural, like ghosts and God, it doesn't belong in science. Why? Because science is strictly defined as being a part of the natural world. And that, again, is important, especially if you have these debates and conversations with people about why they should be teaching religion in class, or why some of the theories that are found in religion about science should be debated upon in a science class. And like I said, one of the biggest reasons that you can talk about is that religion isn't science. Another view of science is that it's a set of practices and procedures for pursuing explanations of the natural world. So these are wonderings and questions to satisfy our curiosity, solving a problem, or improving the quality of life, okay? But it's done in a very specific way through investigating, data collecting, analyzing, validating, and communicating. Again, this is about finding answers to questions as well as pursuing and solving problems to a lot of life's issues. And then finally, science is a way of understanding and viewing the world. It's a lens that we use in order to see the world in a particular way. Now, the important thing to realize is we can't say that science is better than any other subject, like, for instance, art or math or English. They're all related. They're all ways of viewing and communicating and describing our world. Religion, too, is a way that we view and describe and understand our world, and that's important. It's vital to us being human. Science is a main, I shouldn't say main, I'm biased because, of course, I like science, but science is a very important view along with all the other views that we take, depending on what it is that we're trying to examine and understand. So, like I said, the biggest limitation with science is it's limited to evidence-based scientific explanations of the natural world. If we can't defend our explanations with evidence that is obtained scientifically through investigation, data collecting, analyzing, validating, communicating, then it's not science. And then finally, it's a human endeavor, which means there is inherent bias in science depending on your life experiences. And that's actually one of the reasons why in science we collaborate with other people so that we can get other viewpoints. And so that the more viewpoints and more ideas and perspectives that we can get, a clearer picture of whatever answer or problem or question it is can kind of arise, because having those multiple viewpoints can help us move beyond bias from just seeing it through our experience and our lens. So like I said before, science is one of many ways to think about, and I see the typo there, but science is one of many ways to think about and view our world and our experiences. And here are two posters that are made by our amazingly talented artist, Brad Covington. We actually have a collection of these, but it kind of shows, I asked Brad to do a series of puzzles on how these different disciplines actually view a triangle. So here you can see two views. One is in English, and then the other is in science. Now, let's talk about myth busting and the three different reasons why, or I should say, So let's talk about myth busting and what it enables students to do. First, it allows them to design and conduct their own investigations that pursue their own questions. It allows them to critically question and evaluate the validity of the information that they find. And it helps students to discern between what is science and what is not science. It's a practice of being scientists by engaging in the doing of authentic science. And it enables students to be positioned as experts and scientists, which they never get enough of when they're in school. We want them to be positioned as expert and scientists. If we want to grow the world's leaders, then we have to give them opportunities to lead and be experts at the things that they're pursuing or understanding or studying. So having them myth bust and do science is a way to develop positive STEM identities. Now, the other thing I want to talk about is the scientific method, or I should say, get rid of the scientific method. So if you're teaching the scientific method in your class, you need to stop it. And here's the reason why. Science is messy. Now, for those of you, I know most people have written essays, right? When you write an essay, you don't research an essay by using the essay structure. We don't research an essay by looking at a topic first, using a topic sentence. We don't research an essay by having supportive observations and conclusions and opposing viewpoints and all that stuff. The essay is a structure to organize the information that we've gathered and to communicate that information in a clear way that people can understand. The scientific method is exactly the same thing. It wasn't created for us to do science. And the reason why is because true science is about trying things, failing at things, revising things, doing things again, and then repeating those experiments to make sure that your results were consistent and valid and all of these other things. It's not linear like the scientific method. And in fact, the scientific method actually gives science a really bad rap because you don't get it right the first time. I remember in my biotech classes when I taught students, I used to say, listen, expect failure 75% of the time, if not more. It's that 25% that we get, but you only get it with practice and persistence and consistency. So out with the scientific method, and what I'm going to introduce is metamaps, which can help facilitate the process. We develop metamaps at Key Learning, our own version of the science metamap, which looks like this. And actually, you can download it on our site. You can see the link and actually download the whole set of these metamaps. This metamap is in color, and as you can see, it's got leading questions to tell students exactly what needs to go in each of the boxes. Now, the difference is, unlike the scientific method, which is linear, a science metamap is, I would say, kind of like a plate where you're stacking all your food, but you don't want to just dump everything in one place because you can't make order of it. So you put those little bits of investigation, the data that you find, the processes that you find, the hypotheses and the models and things like that in one organized place, so that when it comes time to report things using the scientific method structure, you can do it in an easy way. Now, as a teacher, the other advantage of the science metamap is when you review them at the end of the day, you can actually take a look at where your students are in the process, what they're trying to obtain, and what they're going to be working on next. A great question as they're working on the metamap is you can say, okay, it's the end of the day. What sections of the metamap are you planning on working on tomorrow? And again, the reason why is, as you can see here, we start with observations, right? And then you can go through thoughts, inferences, hypotheses, model, and procedures. It could be that students start out with a procedure and it doesn't work the first day. So they have to go back. They have to think again and infer again and do more research again. And so findings, data, and evidence, all of this stuff can be put in one place so that they can go back. And once they write down their thoughts, inferences, data, and evidence, they can go back and change their procedures and update their procedures and so on and so forth. So that was the purpose of creating a metamap, to be able to do that. Now, what I want to talk about is we're going to do myth busting a little bit backwards. I'm going to tell you about a myth busting lab that I set up and did. And then through that, I'll kind of work backwards and show you the structure that was found inside of that experimental setup. Okay. So, I have always been interested in the best ways of preserving bananas to keep them from ripening on your counter. One of the reasons is because my boys actually really like bananas, but being the teenagers that they are, sometimes they go through these stages where, they may consume a bunch of bananas one day, and then the next day, all of a sudden they don't, and all of a sudden I've got all these bananas, and then later on a fruit fly farm because we haven't gotten rid of them all. So I had this driving question: is there a way to slow down the ripening of a banana? And what is the best way to slow down a ripening of the banana? And if you go on the internet, there are 1,000,001 different sites that talk about how to preserve, or I should say slow down the ripening of a banana. So what you see here, and what I did, is I looked at all those methods. I bought 2 bunches of bananas. And the reason why I have 2 bunches is because I then split each bunch into 2. Okay. And each of these 2 went into a different experimental group. I have 2 bunches because 2 of these bananas and 2 of these bananas went under the same treatment. And 2 of these bananas and 2 of these bananas went under the same treatment, so on and so forth. So that I couldn't say, oh, maybe the reason why one didn't ripen and the other did was because they were, from different bunches or something. I wanted to be consistent. So as you can see here, I split off the bananas. So this is from one bunch and this is from the other bunch. Bunch A and bunch B. And then here were the techniques that I had set up. Okay. Plastic wrap. I put some in the fridge, and then I put some on this banana keeper hanger, which I'll show you here. Because supposedly, as you can see, bananas ripen evenly the natural way, and they stay fresher. So it implies, of course, as I say here, bananas last longer, right? So I got that. And I put 4 bananas on there with numbers, and here are the numbers so that you can see them. Here is the plastic wrapped bananas. And supposedly on the internet, what they say is if you wrap the stems in plastic wrap, it keeps the stems away from, what is it called? It's not ethanol, it's ether. Forgive me, I'd have to look it up again. But it keeps the ripening gases from reaching the stem and supposedly slows down banana ripening. Okay, so again, 2 bananas from one bunch, 2 bananas from the other bunch, bunch A and bunch B. And then, of course, I'm going to go back here to show you. The others I put in a Tupperware container and stuck them in the fridge. And then the control just sat as is on my table. Now, I actually, when I did this workshop at ISTS in Iowa, brought these bananas in for teachers to see. I decided I was not going to take pictures of these bananas or tell you which ones were, slowed down ripening and which ones didn't. I'm going to leave that conclusion up to you, especially if you yourself are curious about running this experiment or you want your students to run the experiment. But as you can tell, the myth, especially as I'm staring at the plastic wrapped bananas here, is it true that wrapping bananas in plastic wrap like this is going to slow down their ripening? And sure enough, by the way, I did find my answer. And you will if you run an experiment like this. So now we're going to work backwards. Here's one of these myth-busting experiments. And as you can see, we have a treatment and we have a control. So in an experiment, your students should, at some point, be free to design their own experiments, okay? In the next generation science standards, there is a lot of discussion about allowing students to take control of their own learning. You can't do that unless you actually give them control. You give them autonomy and choices as to what experiment they want to do, what kind of treatments they want to do, how they want to collect data, so on and so forth. Now, in the beginning, obviously, students are not going to be able to suddenly know how to design an experiment. What I suggest is actually doing an experiment, one or two of these, kind of together. For instance, this banana one is a great one. We did this at the Boys and Girls Club, and kids got to decide how they were going to preserve their bananas. And in fact, one kid decided to put them in the freezer. Another kid mummified his banana. And I tell you, it was really gross, but it was very interesting at the same time. So give them that freedom of what they want to test, okay? Now, you as the teacher hold them to a certain scientific standard. Remember, I talked about the nature of science, right? So in an experiment, there are certain parameters that we have to adhere to. And the reason why we adhere to them is because we want to make sure that our data that we collect is valid, and that it's not due to something that we haven't considered. So these three things are probably the big things that you as a teacher should hold your kids to as a standard. First is an experiment has to have an independent variable. Now, an independent variable, the way I think of it, is the thing that the scientists change. And I'm saying scientists because I highly encourage you to call your students scientists, to call them mathematicians, to call them artists. In other words, you should be calling them by what they're doing because it positions them as the expert in whatever that is. It also gets away from this idea that, kids identify as I'm a math person or I'm a, science person, or I'm not a math person, or I'm not an art person. By calling all your kids scientists, what you're basically saying is you're a science person, you're a scientist because you're doing science. That's all you need in order to be a science person. You're a mathematician, although mathematician doesn't exactly follow the IST rule. Still, you're a mathematician because mathematicians do math. You're a science person because, you're a math person because you're doing math. That's all there is to it. Doesn't matter good or bad. Everybody has bad days when they're doing math and good days when they're doing math. Everybody has bad days when they're doing science and good days when they're doing science. Let's take it away from identifying oneself as being good or bad in a subject. And just for the sake of the subject, let's just call them who they are, scientists, as they're doing this. Okay? Now, so that's why I talked about the thing that the scientist changes is the independent variable. And I know these can get confusing. The way I think about it is the independent variable is the one thing that gets changed in all the different groups, or there's one thing that is changed in all the different groups. Other than that, everything else should be consistent and the same. Now, this is important because the thing is, if you have more than one factor that's different in each of your experimental groups, how do you know then which factor actually correlates to the results that you get? So the independent variable is important, the one thing, and that's one thing you encourage your students to do when they're designing the experiment. What's the one thing that you're changing among all of these experimental groups? Okay, that's the independent variable. The dependent variable is the thing that changes because of the independent variable. I think of it as the dependent variable depends on the independent variable. The dependent variable depends on what you did to change the experimental groups, okay? So, and those variables, because there's actually many usually, get measured and recorded to see a difference. Your dependent variables or variable are the things you measure, the things that you, when you ask, okay, you're doing an experiment, how do you know it worked? What did you record or compare it to? That what is the dependent variable, okay? And then the control is the group without any effect whatsoever. It's the baseline to compare everything to. Because if you actually treated every single one of your experimental groups, you don't have anything to compare it to. And that's very difficult then to know whether or not your experiment was successful, meaning successful as in you got an answer to the question that you asked. And it was a valid answer based on the experiment. Okay? Now, the next thing I want to talk about is hypotheses. One of my biggest pet peeves is that people call hypotheses an educated guess. I can't stand that terminology. The reason why is these are not guesses. A guess implies that you had no experience or understanding going into this, which is certainly not the case, okay? When somebody is doing a medical experiment to find out the treatment between different patients, I certainly hope they're not guessing about the outcome. We also don't want students to think that hypotheses are guesses because it discounts their own knowledge and experience. They're not guessing. In fact, I would rather say hypotheses are inferences based on your prior experience. Kids probably know what an overripe banana looks like. So they're probably going to be able to determine or infer from their experimental design which of these groups are probably going to, have the least amount of ripening. And that may or may not, happen. Now, the other thing about hypotheses, and this is the other reason why I hate the scientific method when it comes to running a lab, is that hypotheses change. They can change on a day-to-day basis. And that's important. It's very important. There have been many medical experiments, like once it gets to the human trial stage, where once people start getting sick, they have to change the experiment. They can't just say, well, we haven't proven or disproven our hypothesis, so we have to go on. No, that's not how science works. If you know, based on the data that you're currently collecting, that science, your hypothesis is off or wrong, you have the ability to change it. Okay, you should go back and change it. You should be able to say, oh, wow, my hypothesis is wrong. So I'm going to go back and think about what it could be now based on this new experience, these new data points that I've collected. Okay, so again, I just want you to rethink about hypothesis and not call it a guess, but call it expert inference, expert advice, right? Or ideas based on what students already know. And like I said, it can change while it progresses. So what were your hypotheses in this banana experiment and why? And realize I am willing to bet as I went through this lab about the bananas, you already had that idea in mind of which groups probably ripened the least. Okay. And that hunch, that gut feeling is what we want kids to talk about and what we want them to write down. Those are their hypotheses. And you as the teacher need to be able to identify that. What do you initially think, everyone? What's your gut feeling about this and how this is going to turn out? What is your idea of an outcome for this based on what you're thinking? And that's important because otherwise, if you say it's a guess, kids really are going to guess. You're not going to get them to think deeply. Hypotheses, you may even want to push them. Why do you think that way? Why do you believe that group A is going to have the least ripening process? What experiences do you have to make you think that this is the one that's going to work, right? And have them think about that. So I'm going to go back. What were the variables in this experiment? I'm going to give you a few minutes, or not a few minutes. I'm going to give you like 15 seconds. And you can pause the video if you're going through this. I would like you to go through it. And then I will go through it, okay? Okay, 15 seconds is too long on a video. You can pause it. You can go back. All right. The independent variable in this was how the banana was stored, right? The dependent variable is the ripening. And we have to, we have to think about exactly what does that mean. Is it color change? Is it number of bruises? Is it number of spots? Is it appearance? Is it a photo of every banana? What evidence are you collecting for showing that it's ripening and what is not? Okay. Your control is the group with no treatment. It's the bananas that just sat on the table. So what data do we need to collect? Like I said, if kids have access to iPads or laptops or digital cameras, taking pictures is a great way of recording these data. But in addition to pictures, they should be recording other things with their senses. Smell, maybe touch. In an experiment like this, if their hands aren't all over and you think it's clean enough, taste. These are all things that they can do while they're collecting data. Encourage them to write these things down. This is where you pull in your ELA skills, right? Or you have kids work on their ELA skills. How do they communicate and describe the situation? It's a great exercise in that. Okay, so now collecting data and making conclusions. Here's some questions that you can ask your kids. I strongly discourage you yourself making those conclusions. In fact, I challenge you to not speak the answer. Instead, how can you ask enough questions to guide students to the answers that all you need to do is repeat what they're saying? That's important. And actually, that's key to this Socratic method of getting kids to think deeply and arriving at their own conclusions. So, can you determine what techniques slowed banana ripening the most? What evidence do you have for this conclusion? And notice these things go in the meta map, right? Under explanations and things like that. Was your experiment valid? Can you trust your data? Why or why not? Now, it is perfectly okay if a student designs their experiment and it doesn't have something like a consistent independent variable or there's more than one variable. It is perfectly okay if something disastrous happens, because this happens in science. I kid you not, where they're in the middle of an experiment and I don't know, the dog eats it off the table, right? Any of these things are okay. It's important to tell your kids failure is okay. We still are learning, right? And you can do it again. You can try these things again. And that's, like I said, it's a really good life lesson, but it's a really good lesson to talk about when you're doing science. And then the question of why or why not. Now, here are some ideas on where to go. Okay, and I'll list some more in the discussion too. I love Mythbusters, and you can find free Mythbuster episodes online. You can just go free Mythbuster episodes and watch a couple of them. Watch a couple of them with your students. Have them use a metamap to apply the different factors to it. This is a really good exercise in dissecting what a really good experiment looks like. And you may even find some experiments in Mythbusters that you have to say, no, that's not exactly valid. I can't actually trust the conclusions. So a really good, highly suggested. The other thing too is Mythbusters experiments, maybe ones that you can carve out versions of it to have your kids do. So a great place to find inspiration. So here are some of my myth busting suggestions. First, is the 5-second rule really true? I love this question because all you really need to do is a couple of petri dishes, right, with agar in them. And because you can actually grow these things without an incubator. You can grow them like in a warm place or something in your room, or, take them home and put them near someplace warm, right? But is the 5-second rule really true? And then ask, well, what affects that, right? Like, is it the kind of food? Is it the kind of surface? Really fun stuff to experiment with there. One thing I highly encourage is that your students may all do slightly different things. You may start with one common question. Is the 5-second rule really true? And then have kids do each of the different experimental groups. Maybe one is, you do the same procedure, but with a different kind of food, or you do the same procedure, but it's dropping the food and letting it sit in different places, right? Like, I would love for a student to drop like a donut on a bathroom floor. I mean, it's absolutely gross and terrifying, but how much fun and how memorable would that be, right? So there's that. Okay. Is there something better than salt to melt the ice? I live in Iowa and I'm from California. The Iowan winters are absolutely evil here. And by the time I get to January, and you'll probably hear this in a lot of videos, I'm going to be done with the ice in the winter. But unfortunately, you usually get about 3 months of just all ice and a lot of slipping and sliding and all of that horrible stuff that is out there, and it's very cold. So this is a really relevant question because unlike when I lived in New York, where, as soon as there was a little bit of snow, the snow plows would come, the salt would come, and we never had to worry about it so much. In Iowa, it gets so cold that salt doesn't actually work well sometimes, so you are driving on ice. So this is a great question to pursue for those of you who live in a cold climate. This might be something to get kids going outdoors and testing, plots of cement on the school or part of a blacktop with, experiment and process or something. You can also do this by taking sheets of ice, borrowing maybe, the freezer in the cafeteria or something if they let you, and then taking those sheets of ice out and having kids put different substances on them to look at melting. Okay, does my sunscreen really work? I love this question because you can easily do it with UV beads in a Ziploc baggie. So you put UV beads inside a Ziploc baggie, seal it, and then you put the sunscreen on the outside. Okay, and obviously the control has no sunscreen, but you can test different kinds of sunscreen. You can test different kinds of materials to see if they block UV light, all kinds of things. This one, because it's a little difficult to get the change in the beads right away, or, sometimes beads change too fast, you may want to have a camera present. I don't know. Actually, it's not a big deal. The materials is the one that changes. When you put sunscreen on it, you can see it pretty well. Okay, does running in the rain really make you less wet than walking in it? I'm going to leave this up to your imagination and the imagination of your students, because that's a fun one to test in many, many different ways, right? So I'm going to leave that, but I'm sure you can imagine. Is there such thing as a sugar rush? One of the ways you can test that is you can ask kids, what did you have for lunch? Are you feeling a sugar rush? And you can test it by testing pulse and heartbeat. Like, if I'm assuming, and that is assumption too, but you don't have to really say it. Like, can you measure a sugar rush? And you would do it obviously with measuring your pulse. Okay, and then does writing by hand really help you remember things better than typing it? You hear about this a lot, and it's a really curious question, right? I'm interested in it myself. And besides which, kids love experimenting with other kids, as long as it's safe. But this is a lovely question to ask. And what you do is you have kids write out a passage. You have another group of kids type out the passage. Not you, the students have their fellow students do this. Write out a passage, type out a passage, and then they take a test that they themselves have created to see whether or not they've remembered those things in the passage. So another classic one for students to do. Does fertilizer really help plants grow better? This is like an upgrade from your typical bean experiment, right? Like you could go wild with this. You can go with organic fertilizers. And I can only imagine kids using manure. Like, let's go there, right? When it comes to being messy. So does fertilizer really help plants grow? Why not try it? Why not try it in addition to your bean growing experiment, right? Why not try different kinds, different concentrations and all that fun stuff? So the next thing is just go myth busting. Write out questions that you have that you would like to investigate. Google labs for myth busting or science myths. And it's totally okay to repeat experiments. It's totally okay to make those experiments better. You may want to do a few of these during the year, maybe the first time it's guided, and then maybe towards the end of the year, once testing is done and the kids are, toward the end of summer, maybe this is something that they design their own labs, right? The questions that you want to think about and hold them to is it testable? Again, I mean, if a kid is trying to test for the existence of ghosts, myth busting for ghosts, that may be a difficult one to test. It's not in the natural world, right? So is it a testable question? Can we answer it through our experiment is really it. What independent variable are you going to change? That's the question there. And then what dependent variables, data, are you going to collect? Those are good questions to ask. Have them use the meta map. And then why these investigations matter. Why is it so important to do this? Because it gives students opportunities to engage in science and engineering practices in very organic ways. They are doing science. They're doing experiments that maybe none of you really have the answers to. And that's fantastic because you're discovering it together. Students use the cross-cutting concepts to make sense of their data and to make connections to the real world. As experts, they need to be able to explain to people what their data mean. And in order to do that, those cross-cutting concepts come into play really well. What systems are they trying to use? What patterns are they trying to determine? What patterns can they explain? What was the cause and effect, right? So a lot of things, like just crack those out when kids are trying to figure out what's going on. Crack those out and see, ask them questions like that. Are you seeing a pattern? What did you see when you did this, right? That's cause and effect, okay? It gives students autonomy and positions them as the expert scientist. That's important. Kids don't get enough autonomy, but autonomy is a main key point of keeping kids motivated. When they feel like they have choices in the things that they do, they're going to want to learn it better. It's a key to self-directed learning. It improves collaboration and communication among peers. Absolutely improves communication, especially when they have to explain what they did in their experiment and what they got. And then finally, it empowers students to question the information they're given, and it gives them ways to test for themselves whether or not that information is true. This is a precious life skill. When we talk about critical thinking means taking the information that we are given and being able to think deeply about it, what it means, what you understand from it, whether or not you believe it, okay? These are really, really important skills. The problem, though, is that our students are brought up in environments where the teacher is the truth. The information they get is always the truth from the textbook or from the videos or things like that. So when they come out of it, they can believe anything. They can be told anything and they believe it. And that's scary. We want to teach them to be critical consumers, to be able to have the knowledge and the empowerment to find the answers to their questions on their own, okay, as citizens. Because think about it, they're going to be the voters for the future. They're going to determine what our society looks like, and they should be able to think critically and make those good, informed decisions that are for the greater good of our society. Now, finally, end with a product. Conclude with something that celebrates and validates your students' work and effort by putting them in control as the experts in their investigation. This is so much better than a sticker, although stickers are fun too, but they shouldn't be the only kind of motivation. You should validate their work. There's something incredibly satisfying watching kids show off the hard work that they've done. Give them that opportunity. Have them present their investigation. Have them report it and tell their parents. Have them come and bring the principal in and report these things to them. Have them write an action letter or make a poster. They can make a video. They can write a letter to a community member about what they found. Empower them. They may want to do an interpretive dance about it. Give them choices on how they can express things. Okay? But don't forget to celebrate. A lot of the classrooms that I visit, when I've done evaluations and classroom observations and all of these things, they leave very little time for reflection and celebration of success. Like the only time sometimes you get the celebration of success is that sticker and that A+ and that great job and these things. But it's not as meaningful as a celebration of a student's hard work. But also what this does when kids end with a product and you're validating their work is that it gives them a lot of confidence in their abilities and skills as well. It's meaningful to them. It says, you did great science. You are a scientist. You're good in science. And that, again, is something you can't get by just saying you're good in science. No, you get it when I really worked my butt off on this science project. Here's what I found. And oh my gosh, this really means something to people. This really counts. This is what I did. I'm the expert in this and I'm telling something that other people don't know. That's the validation, and that's the shiny confidence piece that that so many kids need. Okay, reflection and takeaways. So take a few moments and think about 3 takeaways from this workshop. One thing that I always tell conference people, because it was something that my mentor told me, is when you do a training or when you go through a training, when you go through a conference, take a moment to pull out 3 takeaways that you're going to use right away. You can put everything else to rest. Like I come home with like a pile of stuff that goes into a folder and I may never see it again, but the takeaways stay with me. Okay, the takeaways are internalized because they're important things that I want to use in practice. And not only that, but those are the things that count. That's the reason why, you spend a whole day at a conference, right? Or the reason why you've spent, almost 45 minutes with me. What are the 3 takeaways you took from this? What's the one thing that you can do for this week? So from what you've seen, hopefully I've given you enough nuggets of knowledge that you can use some of this. Don't worry about the fill out input and consent form. I'm using the same slide deck that I did at the workshop, but I wanted to share this workshop with you because so many people found it so helpful. So hopefully you do too. Now, I would love to know what else you had questions on. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments below. You can always also visit the Facebook group and ask there, or just send me an email. Okay. My email is also listed in the comments. It's yen@keylearning.com. Key Learning spelled QI learning.com. And I hope to see you real soon. Thank you so much for watching this. If you like the stuff we do, we're going to be making a lot more of these things. So please subscribe. And the best thing you can do for us, if you love us, is to share that love around. Share us around and let people know that we're here and we're here to help. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful day. And just remember something. You do amazing things every day. As a teacher, you're changing the world every single day. Every kid that you teach, you're touching their lives. And that's just, I really respect you for that. And I appreciate the opportunity to support you in that, noble and amazing endeavor. Have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.